Welcome everybody. For those that don't know me, my name is Ken Smith and I'm very pleased to be your first speaker this afternoon. I work as the Executive Director for Environmental Health and Safety with the University of California. I wanted to talk a little bit about the story that the University of California has been on a journey for the past couple of years on improving our laboratory safety programs. And I want to just talk about a small slice of that improvement, and that's our focus on personal protective equipment in the laboratory environment. And to do that, we've learned that in addition to kind of finding technology and finding physical solutions that enable PPE to be very productive in a laboratory, but also to be very protective in the laboratory environment, we've also learned that along the way we need to have a change in the shift of safety culture. And we need to start affecting people's hearts and minds and their feelings towards safety and what they should be doing. But we've learned a lot of that is about changing those hearts and minds, about how we think and how we envision, how we value laboratory safety. Not only is that a change, I think, undergoing way at the University of California, but it's also a change that's going away at many of your campuses and many at universities and institutes of higher education across the nation. And there's a focus, and just recently the American Public Land Grant University started focusing on what does it mean to have a culture of safety at an institution of higher learning. So now let me get to the subject at hand, which is lab coats. And it's kind of interesting. If you look back on this thing, I always enjoyed this thing. As being a chemist myself throughout school, we used to always get copies of the Sigma Aldrich catalog. And back in the days when they were printed, they'd always put pictures of the alchemist on there by famous artists here. And it's interesting, this is one that graced their covers a number of decades back. And if you look at it, you can actually see that the alchemists back in their days, they were wearing some forms of protective equipment, right? They had their cloaks on, they had their gowns on there. They were even using, if you look in the far right corner there, or left corner, it looks like to be a fume hood cupboard that they were using. And so even at the very early stages of chemistry, there were some basic aspects of what proper laboratory attire should look like. If we look at this one here, this is one of the founding labs of the National Institutes of Health. This is from circa 1880s. Okay? You can see in here that very much so lab coats were instilled. Maybe not safety glasses in here, and certainly they're working with open bench work with cholera, not quite what we would consider high biosafety level standards, right? But certainly it improved grades. And even one of my heroes, Dr. Salk, you see him in his laboratories here. This again is 1950s or so. You certainly see the lab coat, maybe not safety glasses quite yet, but he's wearing his spectacle glasses. But certainly I think there was this indication that wearing a laboratory coat was proper attire, and it formed a number of purposes. One of those purposes was for protection. But something happened kind of around the time, maybe it happened before the years I went to school, but this is an interesting one here. If we look here at this photo here, right? We can start to see that, well, maybe something's not quite right here in the photo, right? We've got one of our professors wearing a laboratory coat, but now what about the students in the area, right? You know, we've got protective gloves, we've got protective eyewear, but what happens? So what kind of happens through the process here when all of a sudden the attire in the laboratory is just your street clothes? Is that appropriate? So let me ask you here, and many of you are familiar with the laboratory environment. If you were to just throw out some ideals, what should a laboratory coat do? We were going to start with a whiteboard, and we said, well, what are the features we want in a lab coat? What are some of the ones that come to your mind? Well, let me talk a little bit about kind of our journey and what we've been doing, and kind of where are we with lab coats, if you think about it for a second. So when we started about 5 years ago, we said, well, we've got to go through a process. And if you've heard one of my talks before, we talked about a software tool called the Laboratory Hazard Assessment Tool that helped us identify what hazards are in the lab, so we could pick an appropriate lab coat. Okay? There are some coats that are barrier coats and provide protection against biological materials, and at the time there were lab coats that are flame resistant that are out there. So we went through this process of identifying what PPE is needed, and then and we did that by asking a series of questions to the researchers. Do you work with this? Do you work with that? Yes, no. And then we had to go out and reach out to our laboratory lab coat manufacturers, a couple of them which are here in the room. And this was very challenging. When we first entered this thing, the only lab coat that was available was a cotton poly lab coat. Okay? There were some treated FR lab coats that were out there, cotton treated ones. And they came in unisex size. That means they're designed to fit just kind of a very stoic looking male. Okay? But we realized, well, you know what, our our user base of chemists is very diversified now. Okay? Roughly about 50% of them are females in the sciences, especially in chemistry. That's a huge accomplishment. The other things that we realized is we wanted a little bit better FR treatment technology. The lab coat worn in the lower corner in kind of the UCLA blue colors, the baby blue colors, that was a cotton lab coat that was treated with the flame retardant. And it works in many circumstances, it's adequate, but because it has a chemical treatment on there, it has some incompatibilities with oxidizers. And in a research environment, incompatibilities in an oxidizers, especially in a chemistry lab, may not be the appropriate coat. It was really intended for the electrical workers with arc flash protection for it. We ended up using a different coat that you see up here by one of our professors up here that is inherently FR. Just by the design of the synthetic fibers, it provides the FR capability. And we learned that to be a much better route. But there were concerns. Historically, I think these were perceived to be very heavy, very sweaty, stuffy, itchy, scratchy, were terms that we heard with it. But we learned that material fabric technology has improved quite a bit. Now, what's interesting here is if I go back to kind of where we are, right? These were the criteria that we said, hey, we would like to see a laboratory coat provide, okay? But if you think about it for a second, which one of these do we actually provide in a laboratory coat? I'll let you just think on that for just a quick second while I show the second of Dr. Wiseman's videos.
I think the biggest problems come when people get comfortable, and this was a procedure I was very comfortable doing, so I wasn't really thinking about as much the possible risks and how quickly something could go wrong because it's something I had done successfully many times before. And I think when it's something that you're used to doing and comfortable doing, you don't think about how quickly something can go wrong and how wrong it can really go. When I was filtering the cleaved peptide away from the resin, I was pouring it through a syringe, and when I put the plunger in, my hand slipped and the solution splashed up onto my forearm. It was kind of a blur at that point. My lab mates got me under the sink. I kept my arm under running water for about 30 minutes. When it went numb immediately, I knew there was something very wrong. It didn't feel like a normal burn would. Now I know that's because all of the nerves were killed. When the doctors first told me that I may need a skin graft, I was really scared because that would be a lengthy hospitalization. Things can go wrong. It was an extremely stressful week of just not knowing whether I was going to go in for this fairly intensive surgery. The course of treatment, first they had to remove all of the dead skin, then get the new skin regrowing, and then I had to wear a compression sleeve for about 6 or more months after it seemed to be healed. Had I been working alone, there's no way I would have gotten under the faucet that quickly. I thought I was working safely. I was working behind the sash of the fume hood and I had my safety glasses on. I guess I was a little bit lucky in that it was only my arm, because a similar situation could have happened where if it hits your face, then you could go blind. Unfortunately, I had to learn the hard way, but hopefully other people can take that experience and realize that they need to be wearing lab coats, they need to be wearing safety glasses. So I think the best practice is to wear a cuffed lab coat that your gloves will cover the end of so nothing can run up your arm. But even if you have a regular lab coat, oh hey, let me show you. You can put a rubber band around the end of it to prevent the same problem. And this is why you will not catch me without a lab coat.
So unfortunately, I think many of our lessons have been from accidents that have injured people, right? But this is kind of where we last left the story, right? We had these lab coats. Certainly we made many improvements working with manufacturers about making a breathable lab coat, reducing the weight of the fabric, reducing the ability for it to transpire vapor and sweat so you can be very comfortable in it, to add a woman's cut, to improve the collar and the closing of the lab coat, to make little slits on the side of it so you can reach in and grab your iPhone, little things like that, that make it a much more wearable environment. With the help of DuPont and their Nomex fiber, we were able to find a very good inherently FR fabric that performs very well. And if you were here at CSHEMA when we were back in the desert in Palm Springs, you actually saw their Pyroman test. And I think that really showed that there is technology out there that can prevent serious injury or lessen the degree of serious injury if there is a flash fire event for it. But unfortunately, after about 100 years of lab coat use, this is where we left it. We were not able to have a lab coat that was non-porous or non-wicking. If you don't believe me, just try it. When you go back to your lab coat, just drop even some water on it and see what happens. Okay? And so the question that you saw in that video there is, well, would a lab coat have made a difference? Could it have been prevented something? And so where I last left it, as we were going on to this, our laboratory safety officers and our chemical hygiene officers had kind of said, and this was an email I actually pulled up last night in there that I wrote back in November of 2012, and I said, well, guys, look, I know there's no perfect solution here, but at best, all we're doing is we're putting on a little absorptive layer. Maybe it can help absorb it and slow down the transfer in enough time that you could strip off that lab coat. But that was about as best as we can do, and today, that's as best as we have on our researchers' back right now.